thank you so much for joining us. I know we're all very busy checking the latest updates on the outcome of the elections. Last time I checked 90 seconds ago, we still did not have a winner, but maybe something will change during the conversation, so we'll make sure to keep you all up to date. But we can already distill certain trends, lessons, and more or less certain predictions about the future. But before we go into the discussion, I want to thank our partners from the Atlantic Council for joining forces for yet another interesting event. Also Ambassador Fried, but also Dennis Forshuber from the Future of Europe program at the Council for helping us to carry through this event. Definitely, as Americans are counting ballots right now, Central Europeans are deliberating how the outcomes will affect the historically close, both in spirit and action, relations of the region with the United States. Thinking about what's going to happen next, we partnered with the Atlantic Council a few months ago to develop a set of recommendations, how the United States and Central Europe can jointly move forward and what kind of post-pandemic agenda we can have. Two of the authors are here today with us. This is Ambassador Dan Fried and Ambassador Jakub Wiśniewski. So I'm pretty sure they will touch upon recommendations that they've made before the elections and explain whether you think that they still stand. But before we go into that, I would like to also introduce two other speakers who are joining us today. That is Eric Bradberg, who is Director Fellow at the Europe Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining. And Dalibor Rohac, who is Resident Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute based in DC as well. And my name is Alena Kucko. I'm Director of the GLOBSEC Policy Institute, joining us from Slovakia. Eric, I'll start with you first. Can you bring us up to date? What is happening right now, and what is the latest prediction on how the outcomes of the US elections are shaping, and potentially with a few indications what it means for the American foreign policy towards Central Europe?
Sure. Well, I think where we are right now is that we're still counting votes. And there's a couple of states that are still counting. Most people predict that Joe Biden has a good chance of getting to 270 electoral votes, which he needs to then be elected president. If that were to be the case, the White House come January 21 will be a Democratic administration. Most likely the Republicans will keep control of the Senate, so you'll end up with a divided government with the Democrats also keeping control of the House. Should we end up with that situation, a Democratic president, Republican Senate, I think we should expect a whole lot of continuity in terms of US foreign policy. I think overall, the sort of focus on China, great power competition, this will largely continue. And there's broad-based bipartisan consensus around Washington that these are the essential challenges we're facing. Where I think there would be differences, of course, would be first of all in tone. I think clearly Joe Biden, who has a long track record of foreign policy and is incredibly pro-European, a committed transatlanticist, would change a lot of the tone that we've heard from, especially from the White House over the past 4 years under the Trump administration. Certainly he would reiterate, US support to NATO Article 5. He would support that the US is in favor of the European project, the European Union, and so on and so forth. So the tone would certainly change. There would be, I think, some quick policy reversals on some of the issues where Trump has essentially taken the US out from previous position that President Obama took, such as the Paris Climate Accords or the Iran nuclear agreement. But overall, again, I think this will be a lot of continuity, and we should expect that Washington, when it comes to Europe, will continue to focus on strengthening NATO, keeping sanctions at bay. I do think that a Biden administration, however, and I'll just end on that, would be perhaps a bit more forward-leaning on some of the issues that have been a little bit maybe on the back burner or more challenging, especially in recent years. I think Ukraine is a good opportunity where Biden could really re-engage, maybe even become part of the Normandy format. I think we could see the US really working to try to help Germany step up and try to shape a vision for Europe, working also with Central Europe. I think Biden could engage on also trying to bring the UK back in, which I think would also be helpful from a Central European point, working with the EU. So I think there are a couple of these issues where, despite the sort of continuity and change in tone, there could also be opportunities for more forward-leaning US approach that would have an impact on Central Europe.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I want Dalibor to follow up here, because what Eric is saying that there is going to be a lot of continuity, of course, with certain change of tone and potentially a reversal in some policy issues. Dalibor, you're, I know, in the heart a Central European and know very well how Central Europeans look at the US. From your perspective, what kind of the United States are we going to see in the next 4 years? And how close Central Europe will be in the hearts of our American friends? Will there still be as much interest in the region, or this marginalization of the region potentially in the foreign policy agenda will continue?
Thank you, Anna. Lot to chew on there, and also in Eric's comments, there are some elements worth reacting to. I think it's worth starting by saying that this really is an extraordinary election in many ways, because it's happening in a pandemic, because there is a record amount of postal vote, because it's happening in an atmosphere of extreme polarization and negative partisanship. Both sides of the political divide are seeing this as an existential struggle, really, and as a result, we are seeing turnout unseen since 1900. Over 159 million Americans, 66% of the electorate, over 100 million votes in early voting, and the election, I think, will leave a lasting footprint. Already, people are finding it extremely puzzling the way the Republican coalition is shifting, how you have minority support for Trump going up relative to 2016, in spite of the 4 years of divisive and oftentimes racist rhetoric. There is a lot of reckoning to be had among pollsters who didn't see the surge of support for Trump. Obviously, we don't know the results yet. The odds are we are headed for a divided government, which obviously, as we remember from the late Obama years, might be a source of obstructionism and dysfunction, but it can also be an opportunity. And I think we'll see in the next 2 or 3 months whether there is a window of opportunity in which McConnell and President-elect Biden, if he's indeed president-elect, will be able to work together on things that cross partisan lines, whether it's infrastructure or some of these questions of foreign policy. Long term, I think it's a big question mark what this means for the GOP, because this election is not going to be a repudiation of Trump and Trumpism. I think that sort of shift towards working class populism, nationalism, I think is going to be longer lasting. I don't think a simple reversal to the fusionism of the old days is in the cards at the moment, and that's going to shape, I think the transatlantic relationship going forward. More importantly, the China question, I think, is going to loom large, regardless of who ends up in the White House. Obviously, a Biden administration hopefully would adopt a more cerebral and more strategic approach towards the issue than the one we've seen so far. There would be, for better or worse, a lot of worshipping at the altar of multilateralism from Biden's side, which obviously is good news for Europe. We need the US to help Europeans strengthen the World Trade Organization by stopping by no longer blocking the appointments of judges to the appellate court. I don't think in terms of trade there is a great likelihood of going back to TTIP or sort of massive efforts at trade liberalization. The Democratic coalition is one that doesn't really give that much leeway for Biden on that front. For Central Europeans, most importantly, I think there is a paradox at the heart of this, which is that I don't think many Central Europeans wish a simple return to the status quo ex ante prior to 2016. When you talk to Central European officials, many will tell you that actually working with the Trump administration has been rather good in terms of access, in terms of the strengthening of NATO's presence on NATO's eastern flank, in terms of LNG infrastructure, etc., etc. I wouldn't necessarily give credit to Donald Trump for this, but I think we should not sort of try to recreate an illusory version of the Obama years and try to just go back to that. I think there'll be a shift on Poland and Hungary, which for the most part, from my perspective, would be a welcome shift. I think the way in which this administration, particularly at the highest level, has sort of encouraged and abated the drift towards authoritarianism and erosion of the rule of law in Hungary and Poland was worrisome. There are some caveats to this shift. I think it's important not to make the perfect the enemy of the good and expect Hungary and Poland to become Denmark or Netherlands in one generation and conflate these basic questions of rule of law and governance with a broader progressive agenda. One opportunity that I see, particularly for Slovakia, by the way, is Biden's idea of a summit of democracies to be held at some point in Washington, and I think that would be an opportunity for Slovakia's president Zuzana Čaputová to really stand up as the voice of the sort of liberal democratic Central Europe to make the case for a region that is not simply defined by its worst excesses of the past decade, but really present a different side of the region. So there'll be, I think, opportunities ahead. There'll be tensions, but fundamentally, I do agree with the idea that there'll be a great deal of continuity.
Thank you so much, Dalibor. And I'm going to go to Ambassador Fried. Ambassador Fried, if you put things in comparative historical perspective, do you see a lot of continuity, and are you worried about the future of the relations between the United States and Central Europe?
For Central Europe specifically, I see continuity. The people around Biden know Central Europe, and Biden knows Central Europe far better than the Obama inner circle when they began. Okay, without Biden, we couldn't have gotten NATO enlargement done in the 1990s. Without Tony Blinken, we wouldn't have organized ourselves in the Obama administration for the sanctions on Russia after their invasion of Ukraine. So this is a serious team that knows Russia, and they're apt to continue what I think are the defensible and welcome elements of Trump's foreign policy. They're going to continue the stationing of US forces in Poland, continue support for NATO's defense of its eastern flank. They're going to be stronger on Russia policy, probably more supportive of Belarusian democracy movement, more consistent on Ukraine. And I don't think they're going to race to a reset with Putin. It's kind of been there, done that. That's all good. I also think that certain initiatives that Central Europe is invested in, like the 3 Cs initiative, have a reasonable chance of surviving under a Biden administration. Those people don't like Nord Stream any more than the Polish government does. They may not race to sanctions against Germany to deal with it, but they don't regard it as a mere commercial project. They haven't swallowed that particular brand of idiot Kool-Aid. That's the good news. The other piece of good news for Central Europe is that the Biden administration, as has already been said, is going to reach out to Germany. It's going to build bridges with the EU. I say that's good news for Central Europe because part of the Trump administration looked at Central Europe instrumentally as a way to weaken Europe. Now that's bad for the transatlantic relationship. It's bad for the United States. I also think it's bad for Central Europe. But I don't think Biden is going to turn away from Central Europe. But here's one caveat, and it's already come up, which is the issue of values. If I were the Polish government, I would pay very close attention to what the US ambassador in Warsaw, Georgette Mosbacher, says. She's a Trump ambassador. She is damned effective. She's got exquisite political instincts, and she's been cautioning the Poles about some ill-considered moves that I hope they don't make. There is enough common ground that I think if the Polish government does not indulge its most hardline instincts that things will be fine. The Hungarian government has probably made a mistake by explicitly endorsing Trump, as has, by the way, the Prime Minister of Slovenia. I mean, go figure. It's never a good idea to take explicit sides in any foreign country's politics. And for Orban to have done that with respect to Trump is a mistake. The Poles have not done that. They've been careful not to, and I applaud them for it. It's been smart. And so I don't think there'll be some kind of political vengeance. Although if there is a hard right offensive in Central Europe, that will be an issue. That will be an issue. But it's not written. It's Central Europe-US relations can be just fine if the Central European governments, particularly the right of center ones, understand that there's going to be a certain degree of skepticism, but that they can manage that. It can be okay. And I hope it is. Look, the Central Europe and the United States have massive overlap in some key areas, and toward Russia, toward Ukraine, toward Belarus. Well, with respect to Hungary, I'm not sure about their Ukraine policy, but Poland, the Baltic states, toward NATO, there's a lot of good to build on, and I hope it works. And a final point, I do think the Polish government in particular has dealt with the Trump administration rather skillfully. They've been constructive and they have tried to steer the administration in a constructive direction. And I think they haven't burned their bridges with the Biden people, and I hope they don't. And anyway, there's more to say, but, and we're not, Biden hasn't won yet. It just looks like, so, I'm assuming he will, but that is not a hard, that you can't bet the farm on that, as Americans used to say.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Jakub, given all what you said, but also what we heard about the fact that even though probably the majority of European foreign policy establishments rather prefers Biden, at least unofficially, and finds Biden a more comfortable person to deal with from the European perspective, but Trump was not unpopular in Central Europe. Ambassador Fried already mentioned, of course, Viktor Orban, who openly endorsed Trump, or the Slovenian Prime Minister, who congratulated Trump, probably among the first in the world. From your perspective, who Central Europeans would like to see in the White House and why?
First, let me say that I saw tweets from the Polish deputy foreign minister who supported Donald Trump. So Polish administration was not that non-partisan in this debate. So they were not able to avoid the mistakes that Dan Fried is talking about in the context of Hungarian government. Of course, the level is important, prime minister versus deputy foreign minister. I want to emphasize that my reading of the situation in Central Europe is that there is no uniform position. There are different ideological stances. Slovakia is so much different from Poland and Hungary. And when I've been watching the news from America over the last 48 hours, I also developed a sort of sense of déjà vu in the context of other countries in a much less developed corners of the world. For example, Ivory Coast, where the incumbent president does not want to accept certain powers of the opposition. So the point I'm making is that Central European populists are watching and they are learning. Also, as regards some dirty tricks that can be played. Kaczynski actually did it in 2013. He said, after losing the elections at regional level, he said there was a massive electoral fraud. was never able to follow up on this, but this shows certain attitude towards democratic standards and the ability to go all the way to acquire and keep power. America, in intellectual sense, during the administration of President Trump, was a very powerful ally of some Central European governments as regards policy issues, but also ideological, cultural wars, so to say. So, for example, if you are a Polish prime minister, you are in a much better company when you are opposing climate change, and actually you want to build coal plants, and you want to evade any efforts to go towards decarbonized economy. Such issues as abortion, overturning the long-term compromises many years back, as a fuel for keeping and acquiring support of some parts of a conservative environment. I think that there is a powerful analogy here between Poland on the one hand and America of Trump on the other. The role of religious hawks. Of course, there were also diverging policies or views, issues such as LGBT rights or independence of media. Friendship between Trump and Putin. This was not supported by Poland, but at the same time, what is crucial is that the bond between some Central European countries and the core of the European Union, namely France, Germany, Brussels establishment, was severed by the Trump administration, who never hid their opposition or their hostility towards the European project as such. And this gave enormous opportunities to these governments, like that of Prime Minister Orban, but also like that of Chairman Kaczynski, to go and win elections through very severe Euroscepticism.
Thank you so much, Jakub. I want to switch back for a second to Ambassador Fried for your also take on the matter and concerning the issues of value. Dalibor was saying that we shouldn't be making the perfect the enemy of the good, and potentially we need to a little bit relax our expectations or just treat with a little bit more understanding countries in the region, which can hardly be compared to countries with different democratic systems that have been in existence for much longer. What recommendations would you give to both sides concerning how we can proceed on establishing better relations in terms of our support to democratic values?
Well, Elena, that's a setup question, because the paper that you and Ambassador Wisniewski and I wrote attempts to do exactly that. And I will give away the bottom line by saying that Dalibor Rohac, without any consultation with us, said many of the same things in his recent piece in Foreign Policy. And the point we made in the paper, and that I deeply believe, is that the Western Europe and the United States need, when they're looking at Central European politics, should not get involved in issues of right or left at all. It's not our business. And we can't conflate all of, let's say, the liberal agenda and believe that that is equivalent to the only legitimate set of policy positions to be considered a democratic country. What we have to do is focus on the most important issues, the basics of democracy, rule of law, media freedom, issues. Of course, I've been following this strike kobiet, the women's strike in Poland, and it's about abortion. It's about a lot of other things. The United States debates abortion. We have strong emotions. I mean, maybe Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court decision that protects the right to an abortion, could be overturned. The United States should not be in a position of lecturing other countries about issues like abortion, on which we have strong feelings and I have strong views myself. right? I'm basically a right to life. I'm a right to choice person. I don't have a lot of sympathy for the right to life arguments, but we should not be holding that up as a measure and project our own political debates onto Central Europe. But with issues of the basic rule of law or media freedom, we need to take a stronger stance, remembering that Donald Trump's commitment to media freedom is questionable. Let's be honest about that. We all in the West have faced different kinds of challenges to our own democratic system. And we need to be modest, and we need not to be partisan, like not ever. The United States after 1989 has worked with all kinds of governments in Central Europe, right, left, center, weird coalitions, ex-communists. It's been pretty good. Okay, it's been pretty good, and we need to just take a step back, pick our issues. Anyway, that's my version of some of the stuff we wrote in the paper, but Jakub and you can take issue and explain it probably better than I did.
Jakub, would you like to jump in here?
To me, it's important to point out that America is not just another country for me and other fellow Central Europeans. I'm sure Dalibor will side with me here. It's we have been educated to perceive America as a mansion on the hill, as a model democracy. That's why we want American friends to preach us about democracy, to support democracy through the projects, programs, and other activities, because otherwise we're gonna end up in a world where elections are contested in such a brazen manner as done by President Trump yesterday and as done by Kaczynski a few years back. So I think that this activist America, which has more to say about the standards of democracy in the region, is still very much needed, and it's not perceived as a imperialist intervention, but rather a family, a community of democracies where we look at each other's hands and we intervene if need be. And by the way, America, of course, has been in the grip of populism to the similar extent as in other countries in Central Europe or in Western Europe, but the difference is the institutions. Your institutions are much older than the ones in Central Europe. That's why we are so vulnerable to the shift to slide towards authoritarianism. And for many people, the standards in especially Hungary and Poland are rapidly eroding the way they did, say, 10 years ago with Turkey and Erdogan government.
Thank you so much. Eric, I want to bring you in here because I know you, and one of the points you were making about the potential of closer cooperation between Biden administration, if there is one, and the European Union. And on the matters of values, European Union was not indifferent, and that was part of the setup of the European Union, that it takes a stance through available legal and political mechanism on the situation with the rule of law and democracy in all the European countries. But also what we saw is that often Central Europeans help themselves by reaching out to Americans and kind of not necessarily undermining the European effort, but finding a bit closer spiritual allies on the other side of the Atlantic. Do you see also an alignment in case of the Biden administration between the EU and US on the issues of support to democracy and democratic values in Central Europe, but also potentially abroad?
I do. I expect that actually, if you listen to Biden, some of his advisors have said, I would expect that democracy, but also issues of corruption and kleptocracy will really be at the forefront of his foreign policy. And I think that should provide opportunities for working with the European Union. Obviously, there's a longstanding debate within Europe on how the EU should best respond to democratic backsliding within the EU. I think there, a Biden administration would actually be forward-leaning, trying to encourage, push Brussels, push other European capitals to actually take tougher measures. But then also, I think, trying to work with the EU on launching some of these initiatives to address issues of corruption, kleptocracy, both within Europe, but also around the world. So I actually would expect that this could be a key part of the US-European relationship if Biden is elected over the coming 4 years. And I think it's time to be creative here. I think the notion that, I think first of all, starting with the notion that we have to be humbled ourselves, given our own shortcomings, I think is a fair point to make. But that doesn't mean that we should surrender, I think, the sort of global democracy agenda that we have traditionally stood for. But I think we should maybe find ways of pursuing it in ways that are more effective. I think we should certainly try to pool our resources, try to create new instruments for funding democracy efforts, not just top-down sort of nation building, but really promoting civil society, funding journalists, supporting civil society groups, stuff like that I think the US and Europe could come together on and do. And then just continuing. I have a paper that's hopefully coming out in a couple of weeks, which will have some additional specific recommendations on this issue of democracy and human rights support, and how a new US administration can work with Europe on that. But I do think it will be one of the issues and one of the frames upon which a potential Biden administration would sort of view the US role in the world. But again, starting maybe from a slightly more humble perspective, and hopefully also doing some introspection, given the challenges that we're currently seeing in the United States. Which, by the way, and that's my last point, regardless, I think, as Dalibor alluded to initially, I think a Biden administration, given the divisions in this country and, given that Trumpism will continue even if Trump is leaving the White House, Biden will be preoccupied with a domestic agenda. Given the fact that this Republicans, again, will control the Senate, that means that his domestic, policy agenda on things like infrastructure, healthcare, economy will be very difficult. And I think that will take a lot of his focus, even though, intrinsically Biden has sort of a foreign policy focus as well. He will have to pay a lot of attention to the domestic issues and try to heal the divisions in the United States, which are ultimately, I think, something that Europe should wish that the US could overcome, because that's also ultimately the basis of US international power as well, its ability to have a stable domestic political situation.
Thanks so much, Eric. And expanding a little bit on your last points about dealing with the domestic situation, but also what Dalibor was saying earlier about the fact that Trumpism in the form of nationalism, populism is likely to be an issue for any administration for the next 4 years. Dalibor, you also mentioned that there's going to be some kind of worshiping of multilateralism. Given all these domestic distractions, how far do you think the worshiping will translate into any kind of action? And what fundamental change or qualitative change, besides the change of rhetoric, do you see in terms of multilateralism, be it on the issues of trade or arms control or anything else?
Well, I think there will be a very significant change in style and rhetoric and the overall predictability of the administration, and I think overall that change will be for the good. From the European side, it is important, just by design of the European Union, it is important that the world be a rules-based system, that it's not a sort of free-for-all Hobbesian world. So having a World Trade Organization that functions is important. Having the United States back in the Paris Climate Accord is important if we are going to tackle the climate issue together. I wonder to what extent the prospect of the US rejoining the Iran deal is realistic, but that's probably a subject for another conversation. That said, the United States is a very special country in terms of its size, in terms of its growing preoccupation with great power competition. So I think there is only so far you can go in the direction of sort of embracing multilateralism and sort of trying to go back to the pre-Trump era. But if I may just say a few words on this question of democracy promotion and the questions of rule of law issues in Central Europe, because I think, not to belabor the point, but I think it's really important to think through the strategy and the framing of such efforts, partly because resources are limited. The United States is not going to convert the world to liberal democracy in a generation, and also because we might have a Trump-like president after 2024, it is important that there be not these massive swings in U.S. foreign policy and in U.S. democracy promotion efforts from one administration to another. So maybe the question is, shall we promote democracy, or shall we maybe invest resources into defending democracy against, rise of kleptocracy, the sort of, foreign interference of various kinds and forms of hybrid warfare, and so I think that's an important conversation to be had on the U.S. side. I was dismayed, like many, by the gutting of various democracy promotion budgets and broadcasting budgets under this administration. But it's also important, while rectifying that situation, that we do not just naively go back to whatever existed before and run with it, because the world is different from the 1990s or the noughties. It's important also to think through the expectations that we have, and this has been already discussed in part, but really the distinction between the sort of core set of institutions of liberal democracy and rule of law on the one hand, and the broader progressive agenda, I think is just fundamental. When I think of the Czech Republic, which adopted same-sex marriage or same-sex civil partnerships in 2006, with some controversy, but not with a great deal of controversy. And then in 2011, then U.S. Ambassador Norm Eisen, together with a bunch of other diplomats, gave their support to the Prague Pride March, with good intentions, provoking this massive backlash and giving fuel to really the most obscure and fringe elements on the Czech populist right, and even prompting the Czech foreign minister, then the staunch Atlanticist Karel Schwarzenberg, to sort of push back that we don't need to be nagged in this area. It was just so counterproductive and so easily avoidable. And then, fast forward to 2018, you have the Sargentini report in the European Parliament that just conflates completely this question of rule of law and liberal democracy with, lingering discrimination against the Roma population, for example, which, is a real problem, but it's a problem that's endemic to Central Europe. That doesn't make Viktor Orban special. What makes Viktor Orban special and what makes the Law and Justice Party special is not that they are socially conservative and that there is lingering bigotry in the two countries, but the fact that there has been this wholesale assault on independent judiciary, independent media, that there is, in some respects, no longer a level playing field for political challengers, and once those two things are conflated, that's precisely the game that the Orbans of the world want to play, because it's much easier to wage a Europe-wide culture war than having to reckon with the sort of real erosion of democracy at home. So I just want to drive this point home, because I don't think it can be stressed enough, and I think it's going to be fundamental for the Biden administration to succeed in pushing back against the democratic erosion in Central Europe. Because we've seen, again, like much of the backsliding in Hungary actually occurred during the Obama years, and we remember that the administration wasn't able to push back effectively. So I think the US has to do better than that.
Jakub, and I want to throw at you the question that we have from Andrei Matishak, but modify it a little bit. Andrei would like to know that given that it seems to be, according to our predictions during this discussion, there is likely to be a little bit of or more than a little bit of a tension between the Biden administration and Warsaw and Budapest. If you were an advisor to the Slovak and the Czech prime ministers, what position would you recommend Bratislava and Prague to take on the matter, and what role they could play in relations with the Biden administration?
I would contact immediately the Biden administration and have them invited to some GLOBSEC conference so that President Biden can have a keynote speech here about democracy. I'm joking, but there is a lot of truth in what I'm saying. He would need to come to a country, essentially European one, which is going through a difficult period like all other European partners, but also located in a very troubled part of the European old continent, with closeness of Russia, with some revisionist tactics going on, with influence of Russia being visible in the democratic sphere, in the social media, etc., etc. Also, I would point out the very positive, potentially positive role of Slovakia and to a degree Czechia as regards the EU's relations with America. There is a lot to do together. It's about common position on China. It's about Iran and non-proliferation. Of course, Paris Treaty agreement, climate change agreement, about digital and ecological recovery that we could take up together in terms of regulations concerning controversial issues like digital taxation. So there's a lot that can be achieved through dialogue between Europe and America, with a special help of Slovakia and other constructive Central Europeans. So this would be my message.
Thank you so much, Eric. I know you worked a lot exactly on the relations between the EU and the United States and how it could look better. You mentioned already the issues of values, but could you please also reflect on what Jakub was saying about the potential of expanding the cooperation in a plethora of other issues, from digital to economy to security, and what exactly the role of Central Europe could be?
Sure. I mean, and I think the basic, if Biden is elected, I think his basic view will be to view the European Union as something positive and to encourage Europe to sort of take more responsibilities. But that's not to say that some of these issues will not be divisive. I do think, there's a lot of debate on Twitter right now about strategic autonomy. I think, most people in Washington, I think, just want a Europe that sort of steps up and takes more responsibility, but a Europe that is still committed to NATO and the transatlantic relationships. I think on security and defense, I'm less concerned, but where I do think there could be tensions early on in a potential Biden administration could be on the digital and technology area, where some of the EU's planned efforts on the Digital Services Act or some of the antitrust regulations will probably not be very positively received by Washington, regardless of whether it's a Democratic or a Republican administration. So I think there will be a need there. And I think Central Europe could play an important role there, along with other countries that are maybe a bit more sort of liberal with a small L when it comes to regulating technologies, working with the US, or at least trying to shape the EU positions. I think climate is another opportunity. Biden will have a much more forward-leaning approach to climate, and he will join the Paris Accords. Maybe his domestic climate agenda will be stymied by a Republican controlling the Senate, but nevertheless, I think putting those issues on the European agenda as well, including in the Free Seas Initiative, I think would provide a lot of opportunities for Central Europe to work with the US on an agenda that's already been quite successful on energy cooperation, broadening that, including renewables and so forth. So I see a lot of some of these areas that I think can be at the forefront. I see Central Europe, being quite well positioned to contribute to the agenda between the EU and the US under a Biden administration.
Ambassador Fried, I want to bring you in here, and I have two questions for you. The first one, we had this discussion about the importance of showing up, and Jakub mentioned that Biden could make a trip to Slovakia or maybe Czech Republic, or just to pick the country that would illustrate his best bets in terms of the support and the values, but also closer cooperation in the region. How soon do you think would be a visit of Biden to the region, given the scale of other priorities in the world? And the second question goes back to the discussion on the cooperation between the EU and the US. I know you recently worked on the issues of digital cooperation between Central Europe and the United States. And again, Eric said that the EU and US do not necessarily see eye to eye on digital issues, especially on the issue of regulation of the technical giants. From what you see, is it Central Europeans are a constructive players to bridge the EU and US visions of the digital agenda, or we're still trying to play against each other?
I can't give a well-informed answer about the digital question. I think in theory, Central Europe could play that role because the Central Europeans are doing quite well in the digital economy. A lot of the American social media and tech companies like setting up shop, kind of their back office plants in Central Europe, because there are an awful lot of smart people there, and the wage levels are still lower than in Denmark. So I think that's a real plus. But one area where I see potential cooperation is in a piece of trade. Earlier, somebody said that a Biden administration is not going to pursue TTIP and classic trade agreements because of the domestic constituencies, and this may be right, but the US is certainly going to have to address China's gaming and exploitation of the world trading system. Europe is ready to do that, and issues of supply chains may come up. There's a lot of talk, loose talk so far, but a lot of talk in the Washington policy community about kind of free world trade agreements embracing democracies that accept the rule of law, including in business, and don't game the system with enforced intellectual property transfers and other exploitations like the Chinese do. Well, Central European leaders at very high levels have said, look, in any kind of supply chain realignment, moving upstream production from China to someplace else, Central Europe is poised to gain a lot. So I can imagine Central Europeans using their collective weight in Brussels to try to move this along. It would be good for the transatlantic relationship, good for the economies of Europe and the United States, and particularly good for Central Europe. There's a lot of money to be made, and thereby good politics. My advice to the Central European governments would be, explore this. It's a really good idea, with a footnote that to do this, they need to be getting along with Brussels, not spending all of their political capital picking pointless fights with Brussels. Now so I smell opportunity. I also think energy cooperation is a huge potential area. I mean, my God, coal, look, let's face it, coal is not coming back, not ever. Natural gas is there as a transition, as a transition fuel for a very long transition. Nuclear will have a place, renewables are a coming thing. Central Europe is a place, can carve out for itself a strong place. On the manufacturing side, the R&D side, perhaps, there's both a need and an opportunity. So I see all kinds of areas of potential overlap. Now, to get to your last question, when would Biden come to Central Europe? Slovakia, President Čaputová sounds, her election was a fairly big deal and counter to the lazy narrative that authoritarianism is the wave of the future. And I said lazy narrative because it's a kind of Washington lazy journalistic cliche based on something but exaggerated. Čaputová goes against that grain. If Biden's team is looking for a way to show its support for Central Europe in general, but have it sort of a different face, Bratislava. I mean, Jakub was talking about, him showing up for GLOBSEC. That would probably be on a short list of possibilities. That's the good news. The bad news is, he's going to also need to go to Berlin pretty damn fast. And then there is the Summit of Democracies he's talked about. Okay. I always thought that Obama wasted his trip to Prague in the spring of '09, where he talked about, nuclear disarmament. Don't forget, Biden is the most pro-European incoming US president since probably George H.W. Bush. Obama was skeptical about Europe. It just kind of didn't care. He thought it was yesterday's thing. Trump is actively hostile to Europe as an organizing idea. And George W. Bush spent his first term picking fights with Europe and reconnected successfully in the second term. That's maybe an exaggeration about George W. Bush, but there was some truth to that. Biden likes Europe. He knows Europe and he likes Central Europe. If the Central European governments make it possible, they don't have to worry about a Biden administration. They just have to not do stupid.
It's a wise advice in all aspects of life, for sure. I want to throw back at Eric 2 points, because you earlier were talking about a little bit trade in China, and we'll get back to Dalibor with a similar question. I understand that Biden is, by measurements, the most pro-European president that might happen. But even if he doesn't happen, or if he happens, there's still a lot of protectionism from the US side that is likely to stay there, or not necessarily the Congress is going to be wholeheartedly supporting the free trade agreements, be it with free world or not so free world. Eric, do you see it as feasible that there is going to be some kind of a deal between the US and US and Europe and Central Europe as part of it in trying to rearrange the global supply chain and the global economy, and making Europe and Central Europe a reliable strategic partner for the United States, taking all these factors into consideration? And as a top up, we have a question also from Jason Woolridge about the US cooperation with Central Europe and countering Chinese influence in the region.
Sure, that's a lot, but let's give it a shot. I think on trade and first of all, Biden's domestic economic agenda, I agree. I think there will be continuity here too. I think the US will kind of stay on this more protectionist economic nationalist path. Biden has talked about industrial policy. He's talked about Buy America. The Senate may block some of those initiatives, but I don't think, and the Democrats are not traditionally very pro-free trade, so I wouldn't expect too much in that area. But I do think this focus on China will continue. The US will want to have like-minded partners work with them to address China, and where I think even though Biden shares the similar view of Trump in identifying the problem stemming from China, which Ambassador Freed talked about, has to do with China's forced technology transfers and excessive state subsidies and so on and so forth. I think his prescription will differ from the Trump administration's approach. It will be much more of an emphasis on allies and partners, bringing them along, trying to shape a more joint positive agenda, which, by the way, could also put more pressure on Europeans to also kind of deliver and step up. But I would expect that to be a big part of the focus. And then also, I think, I don't think we should at all expect an attempt to go back to TTIP. That sort of boat has passed. What I think a Biden administration may put their efforts onto is trying to get the Europeans and maybe others like Japan to work on reforming the WTO. To address some of these issues. So it's an approach towards multilateralism in the sense that we're not just going to embrace multilateralism wholeheartedly, we're going to try to fix the problem in multilateralism to make it more effective with an eye towards this great power competition that's been mentioned of trying to address challenges stemming from China. And I think that approach will translate also to an issue like supply chains. I don't think we should expect that the Biden administration would engage some type of international organization on something like this. I think what we will be looking for is bespoke coalitions and platforms of a myriad of countries that includes countries in Europe, but it probably also includes, like-minded democratic allies in Asia, Japan, Australia, and others. And those type of coalitions, I think a Biden administration would be quite well suited to try to cobble together and try to lead, but maybe not always as sort of being in the driver's seat, also encouraging others to step up and do more. I think we could see bespoke initiatives there on things like 5G, on things like supply chains, but it wouldn't necessarily be like a grand US-EU deal. It would be a much more bespoke, flexible type of arrangements on a host of issues, including supply chains, for instance.
Thanks so much. And the same question to Dalibor.
Sure. I think there's an interesting paradox in the fact that I believe that Trump does deserve some amount of credit for bringing this question of China to the forefront. I mean, the way it resonated in the 2016 election across partisan lines, I think it was a sort of opportunity that was just ripe for picking, and he did it. At the same time, his political style and his personality has been so toxic that I think it quite literally made it impossible for Europeans to join in fully in the US efforts. When you think about attitudes towards the Trump administration in a country like Germany, so as a result, the EU is now left with this sort of ambivalence between treating China as a partner in various multilateral structures against a seemingly hostile United States, while simultaneously understanding that China is also a rival and a challenger to the rules-based order. So in that sense, there will be, in my view, an opportunity to do more together. And one important area, I think, is, while we were not looking and while we were being distracted by populism and European crises of various kinds and Trump, countries such as China and also Russia have been making headway in colonizing many of the institutions and organizations underpinning this rules-based system. Various UN agencies, the World Health Organization, I think, is a very good example of what happens when you hand over the leadership to a candidate supported by China, who then massages the information going out of Taiwan, for example, at the beginning of this pandemic. And this is something that the Trump administration, I think, in its later years have been waking up to, and recognizing the need to build coalitions within these various international agencies and working with US partners to actually make sure that free societies push back against Russian and Chinese influence. And I think the stakes are enormous when you think about the ITU, for example, where really China and Russia would like to see a balkanized internet, where there are firewalls and barriers to the free flow of information. When you think about the World International Intellectual Property Organization, where actually there have been some success in getting a Singaporean candidate elected. There's the Universal Postal Union. This whole area of just setting standards, some of them binding, some of them voluntary. I think that area requires just much more of a concerted effort by the world's democracies to work together to make sure that we actually are not beaten by our own tools, by the world's kleptocracies and autocratic regimes. And I think that's going to be one very important element of transatlantic relations going forward. And I hope that Central Europe will play its role in it as well.
I agree with that. And I want to add one thing, because Dalibor has raised a couple of times an important point, which is the rules-based order. It's not just Europe that wants this. This was an American idea originally, 120 years ago, and then 100 years ago with Wilson. And that's what Harry Truman puts into effect after 1945. And it's not just idealism. It's America's sense that a rules-based order would work well for us, Americans, and for the rest of the world. And that rules-based order is something that Biden believes in his bones. Trump doesn't. He believes in a pre-1914 world of nationalism. Okay, where there are no rules, it's might makes right. I'm oversimplifying, I get it, but I am confident that that is where Trump is coming from. Now, there's a Central European role in this. The Poles in particular, but Central Europeans generally, all through the Cold War, basically told the Americans, the Democratic opposition told the Americans, for God's sakes, don't forget your own basic principles. Look at us through a prism of values, not through realpolitik. Okay, because realpolitik was accepting the Brezhnev doctrine, okay? Which is sort of what Nixon and Kissinger were flirting with in the 1970s, let's face it. But that's not where Reagan took us and not where Brzezinski-Carter took us. And so the notion of values should not be regarded by the Central Europeans as aliens, because they were the ones who pushed the Americans. And they did so before 1989, and they did so in the 90s during the debate over NATO enlargement. I ought to know. I was on the receiving end of those arguments, and they were right, okay? The Central Europeans were right when they told the Americans, for God's